Emily Harper had always been described as fearless. At 29, she had already summited Mount Rainier twice, trekked through the rainforests of Costa Rica, and even camped solo in Alaska. That summer of 2017, she had her eyes set on Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, a place she'd read about in an old hiking magazine. She planned a 3-day solo hike, carrying only her essentials, a backpack, her phone, a small tent, and a weathered leather journal she wrote in religiously. Before leaving, she told her sister, "If I'm not back by Monday, don't panic. This is my time to be away from the noise." She arrived in the small town of Hamilton, Montana, on a Friday afternoon, staying overnight at a rustic lodge before hitting the trail at dawn. Locals remembered her well, a friendly young woman, with a bright blue hiking jacket and a contagious smile. At 7:14 a.m. the next morning, Emily bought a coffee from a roadside stand and asked the barista for directions to a rarely used trailhead called Raven's Pass. The barista hesitated, then replied, "Not many people go up there anymore." Emily only laughed and said she preferred places where nature still feels wild. The trail started innocently enough, golden grass swaying in the wind, the distant scent of pine, and a sky so clear it almost didn't look real. Emily took photos along the way, sending a few to her sister. The last message she sent read, "This place feels untouched, magical." Her phone's GPS showed her on track for the first leg of her hike, but around noon, her digital trail went silent. When she failed to return by Monday evening, her sister called the local sheriff's office. By Tuesday morning, search and rescue teams were combing the trails, using dogs, drones, and volunteer hikers. They found her parked car still at the trailhead, locked and undisturbed. On the second day of searching, a park ranger spotted her backpack lying near the edge of a steep ridge. Inside were her journal, a half-full water bottle, and her phone, its battery completely drained. Oddly, there were no signs of a struggle or fall. The ground around the backpack was undisturbed, as if Emily had set it down intentionally. From that point, the search teams noticed something deeply unsettling: faint footprints, barefoot, leading away from the ridge and into the dense pine forest. The temperature at night had been near freezing, yet the tracks showed no indication of boots or shoes. Then, without warning, the footprints simply stopped. When the barefoot tracks were first noticed, search coordinator Bill Radcliffe assumed they belonged to a local hiker, or possibly a child from one of the small mountain communities. But as he followed them deeper into the forest, he realized their size matched Emily's narrow, with a slight inward turn on the left foot, exactly as her sister had once described from childhood. The strangest part was how evenly spaced they were, as though she had been walking calmly, not running or stumbling. Despite the frigid air and rocky terrain, the pine forest they led into was unnervingly quiet. Even in broad daylight, the thick canopy overhead blotted out much of the sun, leaving the forest floor in a dim green haze. Search dogs became skittish the moment they entered, whining and pulling at their leashes. One handler reported his dog refusing to move forward, planting itself firmly on the ground as if sensing something ahead. A few rescuers later admitted privately that they felt as though they were being watched, eyes following them from somewhere just out of sight. As the team pressed forward, the footprints became more erratic. They veered off the faint animal paths, weaving between trees and over patches of moss where no tracks should have been possible to see. Yet somehow, the depressions were still there, clear as day. It was as if the ground had softened only for those steps. Even stranger, they noticed small clumps of pine needles scattered unnaturally across the trail, as though deliberately placed in piles. By late afternoon, the prints ended abruptly in a small clearing. The ground here was hard-packed dirt, with no grass or foliage to disturb, and yet the searchers swore they should have seen where the person had gone. There was nothing, no continuation of the trail, no bent branches, no signs of crawling or climbing, just an empty clearing surrounded by towering pines that seemed to lean in ever so slightly, their branches almost touching overhead. That night, the search was temporarily called off due to falling temperatures and an incoming storm. Several team members reported hearing faint, distant cries somewhere beyond the clearing, carried on the wind. It was impossible to tell if they were human or animal. But more than one rescuer claimed the voice was calling a name, not Emily's, but something unintelligible, repeated over and over. Fading into the darkness, weeks turned into months, and Emily Harper's disappearance shifted from front-page news to a haunting local mystery. The search and rescue operation officially lasted 12 days before transitioning to recovery mode, a softer way of admitting they no longer expected to find her alive. Flyers with her smiling face were pinned to bulletin boards in grocery stores, gas stations, and post offices across western Montana. But as autumn deepened, the number of volunteers dwindled, and winter storms buried the Bitterroot trails in deep, unforgiving snow. In early 2018, a pair of snowshoers claimed they saw something unusual near Ravens Pass, a figure in a blue jacket, motionless among the trees. But when rescuers rushed to the location, all they found was an abandoned scarf tangled in a low branch. It wasn't Emily's. Strangely, the snow around the tree was untouched. No footprints leading in or out, as if the scarf had simply appeared there. That incident was quietly filed away as unconfirmed. Over the next few years, scattered and unsettling reports continued to surface. Campers described hearing the sound of a woman humming softly near their tents at night, only for the noise to stop the moment they stepped outside. Hunters swore they saw flashes of movement, someone darting between the trees only for their tracks to vanish into nothing. One seasoned trapper even reported finding a circle of stones in the forest, each etched with a spiral-like carving, with no sign of who had placed them. Emily's family, especially her sister, refused to give up. Every summer, they organized a small search party, retracing the trail from the ridge to the clearing where her bare footprints ended. They carried her photograph, called her name, even left food and water in case she had somehow survived in the wilderness. Each time, they returned with nothing but silence and the uneasy sense that the forest itself was swallowing their efforts. By 2022, the official records listed the case as inactive, but among locals the story had taken on a life of its own. Around campfires and in dimly lit bars, people whispered about the woman of Ravens Pass, a figure who appeared in the woods only when the fog rolled in thick and the wind fell silent. Some said she was a ghost. Others claimed she was still alive but no longer entirely human. It was late autumn of 2023 when the first real development in Emily Harper's case came in 6 years. A seasoned hunter named Thomas Grady was tracking elk deep in the Bitterroot Mountains when his GPS failed, forcing him to navigate by instinct. The air was heavy with fog, and the silence was so complete that his own footsteps sounded unnaturally loud. That's when he noticed something unusual, a narrow gap between two massive boulders, partly concealed by wild brambles. Curious, he pushed through, expecting to find a small meadow or animal trail. Instead, the path dipped sharply, leading to a secluded valley floor almost no one would stumble upon by accident. In the center of that hidden clearing stood a structure, a cabin so weathered it looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. Its roof sagged under years of moss and pine needles, and the wooden walls were silvered and warped by time. The windows were dark, their glass fogged and cracked. Thomas later told authorities that the sight of it filled him with a strange, uneasy familiarity, though he swore he had never been there before. He couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin had been waiting. Approaching cautiously, he noticed the front door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the cold breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Dust coated nearly every surface, except for a few spots where it had been disturbed recently, a set of scuff marks near the table, an overturned tin cup, and the faint indent of someone having sat on the floor. A stub of candle sat on the windowsill, wax dripped unevenly as if it had been burned for hours in the dark. What unsettled Thomas most was the absence of cobwebs in certain corners, as if someone had been sweeping them away despite the cabin's apparent abandonment. Near the fireplace, a wool blanket lay crumpled, worn thin and smelling faintly of smoke. Next to it was a rusted tin of beans, half-eaten, the lid jaggedly peeled back. Whoever had been there, they had left in a hurry, or perhaps they hadn't left at all. As he examined the hearth, Thomas decided to light a fire to fight off the chill. But when he struck a match and placed it under the kindling, the smoke billowed out into the room instead of drawing upward. The chimney, it seemed, was blocked. At that moment, the wind outside shifted, and the front door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crack, leaving Thomas in dim, flickering light and a growing sense that he was not alone in that cabin. Thomas stepped back from the hearth, frowning at the thick, gray smoke now curling through the cabin. He coughed, waving it away, but the air grew heavier with each breath. Something about the smell was wrong, not just wood and ash, but a faint, acrid undertone that made his stomach knot. He muttered to himself about birds' nests or animal carcasses, blocking the flue, but deep down, his instincts were telling him this was different, much different. Determined to clear it, he set down his rifle, dragged over a chair, and climbed up to peer inside the fireplace. At first, all he could see was darkness. He reached in with a stick, poking upward, but the stick struck something solid within just a few feet. The sound it made wasn't the dull thud of wood or stone, it was softer, almost hollow, like striking an old leather coat or dried bark. But when the stick scraped against it, a flake of something pale and brittle fell onto the hearth. He froze. The fragment didn't look like wood at all. In the dim light, it was off-white, irregular, with jagged edges, almost like bone. For a long moment, Thomas didn't move, his pulse thudding in his ears. The smoke continued to curl around him, stinging his eyes and blurring his vision, but he couldn't shake the urge to see what was lodged up there. Slowly, he climbed onto the roof, boots slipping on the damp, moss-covered shingles as the fog thickened around him. From above, the chimney's mouth yawned black and narrow. Kneeling beside it, Thomas shone his flashlight down into the darkness. At first, the beam caught only motes of dust swirling in the air. Then, just a few feet down, it landed on something unmistakable, the curve of a skull, wedged tightly in the flue. The jaw was tilted at an unnatural angle, the teeth clenched as if in silent protest. The skull's surface was cracked and weathered, but still intact enough to make Thomas's breath catch in his throat. He sat there for several seconds, the cold wind biting through his jacket, his mind racing. This cabin wasn't on any maps, and the trail to it was almost invisible. Whoever ended up here hadn't stumbled across it by accident. And now, lodged in its chimney, was a human skeleton, curled into a position that made no sense. Thomas's first thought was to get down and run, but the forest around him had gone eerily still, the silence pressing in as if waiting for him to make the next move. When Thomas finally made it back to town, pale and shaking, he reported what he'd found to the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office. Within hours, deputies, forensic teams, and a small search unit were making their way to the cabin. They moved slowly, carefully photographing the approach as though the forest itself might erase the path if they looked away too long. The cabin's interior was exactly as Thomas had described: the candle stub, the blanket, the half-eaten beans, and then the chimney, where the skeletal remains waited like a terrible secret wedged in stone. The extraction was painstaking. The body was curled in on itself in a fetal position, jammed tightly as if it had tried to climb upward but gotten stuck. The bones were surprisingly intact, though coated in soot and streaked with faint scratches. As the forensic technicians worked, one of them noted something odd. The scratch marks inside the chimney flue weren't just random scrapes. They appeared deliberate patterns that almost formed symbols, though whether from human fingernails or some tool was impossible to say. Once removed, the remains were airlifted to the county medical examiner's lab. There, the examination began. The first step was a dental comparison, and within days, the results came back. The teeth matched those on file for Emily Harper. After 6 years, the search for her had ended in the most unlikely and disturbing way imaginable. But the confirmation only raised more questions. Why had she been in that cabin? How had she ended up in the chimney? And why were there no signs of the broken bones one would expect from a fall or struggle? The medical examiner noted something else troubling. While the skeleton showed signs of prolonged exposure to the elements, there was no evidence she had died immediately upon becoming trapped. Tiny chemical traces in the bones suggested she had lived for days, maybe longer, before finally succumbing. That detail unsettled everyone in the room. The thought of Emily alive, wedged in darkness, scratching at the chimney walls, sent shivers through even the most seasoned investigators. When the sheriff announced the identification publicly, reporters swarmed the small Montana town. Emily's sister broke down during the press conference, clutching the same photo she had carried on every search hike. Yet as the cameras clicked, she made a statement that caught everyone off guard. "If you find her journal in that cabin, don't read it out loud." The room went silent, and the sheriff didn't elaborate, but several reporters claimed they saw a flicker of unease cross his face before he ended the briefing. In the weeks after Emily Harper's remains were identified, the cabin became the focal point of an intense investigation. Every inch of the structure was documented, from the warped floorboards to the dust patterns on the shelves. That was when deputies found it. Shallow etchings carved directly into the interior walls, some faint and others fresh enough to leave splinters. They were not random marks. Over and over, in uneven block letters, one phrase repeated across the cabin's interior: "It's still outside." The writing wasn't limited to the main room. It appeared behind the door, along the narrow hallway, leading to the single bedroom, and even faintly on the underside of the wooden table. Investigators argued over whether the words had been there for years or if they were made more recently. Some carvings were too small and cramped to have been done comfortably, as if the writer had been crouched in fear while making them. Others seemed rushed, the letters uneven, like they had been scratched out in the dark. The sheriff's department kept most of their findings private, but rumors leaked. One deputy reportedly admitted to a local bar patron that there had been more than writing on the walls in the bedroom. The mattress had been shoved against the only window, as if blocking something from coming in. In the fireplace, beneath the ashes, they found several charred items of clothing, none of them belonging to Emily. Some were decades out of style. The deputy refused to say more. Even stranger were the accounts from officers who stayed at the cabin overnight during the initial evidence collection. One swore he heard faint scratching against the outside walls in the middle of the night. A sound that moved from one corner of the cabin to another, slow and deliberate. Another claimed he woke to find the front door wide open, despite having locked it himself before bed. The thick fog outside seemed to press against the doorway, almost like a living thing, before he slammed it shut. By spring, the official investigation was wrapped up, but no explanation was ever given for what Emily was running from or toward. The cabin was quietly removed from public land maps, its coordinates sealed. Yet locals still warn hikers to avoid the remote valleys near Raven's Pass. Some say the forest is different there. The air heavier, the silence more complete. And if you stand too long in one place, you might hear it too, the soft scrape of fingernails against wood, just beyond the tree line. To this day, no one knows what Emily Harper saw in those mountains, or what drove her to that cabin in the first place. The case is officially closed, but in the Bitterroot people still speak her name in a lowered voice. Hikers claim the forest feels wrong near Raven's Pass. The air distills the shadows too long. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick, and the trees creak in the wind, they swear they can see a faint figure in a blue jacket, watching from between the pines. Just far enough away that you can't be sure she's really there.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.